Good morning, good morning, good morning, good morning, everyone. My name is Cynthia Gooch Grayson, and I serve as the Associate Vice President for Equity and Inclusion at Metropolitan Community College. It is my honor to welcome you to the final virtual program honoring Native American heritage in 2021. November is National Native American Heritage Month. While November is a time to rejoice in diverse and rich cultures, histories, and traditions, and to appreciate the great contributions of Native Americans, it also allows us to spread awareness about tribes or to educate people about the various challenges faced by Native American populations in the past and today. We recognize that Metropolitan Community College campuses were built on indigenous homelands and resources that were previously cared for by people from the Omaha, Ponca, and various regionally based tribes that traveled to and from their original homelands. Ponca Chief Standing Bear and his people were held on the Fort Omaha campus, this very campus where Barbara and I are located today, in 1879, pending his landmark civil rights case granting Native Americans the right of habeas corpus. The United States obtained the land from the Omaha Nation in the Treaty of 1854. We recognize our obligations to this land and to the people who took care of it, as well as to the nearly 18,000 Native people who live in Nebraska yet today. The 2021 National Native American Heritage Month theme is Together Towards Tomorrow. Your microphones and chat with other audience members are turned off, but you may always contact the host. Send any questions that you have to me at any time. Please watch the chat for a link to the online evaluation. Mr. Vernon Miller is a member of the Thunder Clan from the Omaha tribe of Nebraska and Iowa. Currently, Miller is the Assistant Director for Cornell University's pre-freshman summer program and an area coordinator for Cornell's South Campus, upper level and transfer student populations, and previous Residence Hall Director for Aguago, a Mohawk, the Aguago Residence Hall, and the American Indian Indigenous Program House at Cornell University. And Vernon educated me this morning that Aguago means, it's a Mohawk word that means all of us. And I think that was appropriate to share this morning. He received his Master's of Science in Counseling and Student Development from Kansas State University and his Bachelor of Science in Business Education from the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. In addition, he recently served as president of the Omaha Nation Public Schools Board of Education and is the former Omaha Tribal Chairman. Miller is also a National Racial Equity and Healing Fellow with the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, an Americans for Indian Opportunity Ambassador, and a 2016 Fellow with the New Leaders Council Omaha chapter. I am happy and elated that he took time to be with us here at Metropolitan Community College with us once again, although virtually. Vernon?
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Cynthia, for that introduction. It's my privilege today to introduce you to our speaker today, Cheryl Crazy Bull, which is also pronounced Wacinyanpi Win, which means they depend on her. Cheryl is Sicangu Lakota and president and CEO of the American Indian College Fund, serving since 2012. Cheryl is a frequent public speaker, presenter, and writer about Indigenous education and issues with a focus on Indigenous higher education equity and place-based education. She served as a faculty member and administrator at Sinte Gleska University and as the chief educational officer at St. Francis Indian School on her home reservation, Rosebud. Prior to the College Fund, Cheryl served as president of the Northwest Indian College for 10 years. The Native American Finance Officers Association honored her with a Lifetime Achievement Award in October of 2019. In March of 2020, CBS paid tribute to Crazy Bull, along with 6 other females, as an example of what it means to challenge and overcome stereotypes and biases in their industries as a part of a series of CBS CARES public service announcements. Working Mother Media named her their Legacy Awardee at their Multicultural Women's Conference in July of 2020. Everyone, please help me welcome Ms. Cheryl Crazy Bull, who will present Revolution in Higher Education, the History of Tribal Colleges.
Oh, good morning, everyone. Midakayepi, Chante Washte, Nape Chayusapi, relatives. I greet you with a good heart and a handshake. It's my honor to be here with you today to talk about the institutions that are closest to my heart, tribal colleges and universities. I like to begin with a land acknowledgement, recognizing that the College Fund is on the traditional homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute Nations. The Lakotas call the Rocky Mountains Heska, or the White Mountains. Today, we have literally thousands of Native people living in the Denver area, many who came here as a result of relocation when it was the policy of the federal government to move Native peoples to urban areas for jobs and other reasons, and which had that impact of really diminishing the relationship that Native people had to their cultural identity, which is kind of part of the whole discussion today. I believe in land acknowledgements, but I believe that it's also really important when you do that to share some accomplishment or some of the history of the people here. And I just wanted to note that there have been actions by the state of Colorado to support Native higher education, legislation that's providing in-state tuition to citizens of over 50 tribes with historical ties to Colorado, as well as a recent bill banning mascots. And so acknowledging land is great, but we definitely need to be able to speak to the things that we do as people to remedy the experiences that Native people had. I'm going to give just a real brief kind of description of how the history of Indigenous people's experiences, which led to the establishment of tribal colleges and universities. So just kind of a reminder to everyone that when Europeans came to what is now the Americas, there were very diverse groups of Indigenous peoples all across this hemisphere. We had very deep cultural and social and economic systems in place, our own political systems, but we were diverse as a peoples. And we also were very different from the Europeans that came to the country. They had a high desire to access our land and its resources, and that drove them to the practices of colonization and genocide. And so it's important for us to remember that as we think about the role of education today. We see, of course, as Indigenous peoples and our allies, that it is that continued need to own these resources that has reinforced false narratives about the history of the United States and has really denied appropriate restitution to us as Indigenous peoples for the losses that we experience as a result of that genocide. I just as a resource, I like to mention these three publications that I think can be really educational for people. And Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States really describes the incredible challenge that Indigenous people had with the practices of the colonizers. If you read this book and then look at some of the other resources that went into the development of the book, you'll see that we as Indigenous peoples, although we did engage in warfare and all the things that go with that, we just could not fathom the kind of genocidal practices that occurred against us when people came and settled this land. And there's just some really interesting work out there about those practices and how we were just unable to overcome them because they were just so inhumane. And of course, the book edited by Suzanne Schoen-Harjo, Nation to Nation, which looks at treaty relationships, and one of my longtime favorites, Alvin Josephi's book on the Civil War in the American West, which really looks at the the fact that the United States needed to find a way to continue to support its army, its military, and that the Civil War, after the Civil War, the military came into, what we now call the American West, or coming west of the Mississippi River, and devastated our country. When I think about the experience of education, I think about the roots of colonial education. There's a lot of research that's been done about the establishment of higher education in America. There's some excellent writing that looks at the early institutions, many of which are now what we would call the Ivy League institutions like Dartmouth and Harvard, but also others like William and Mary, were really established using the resources from plantation owners, slaveholders who wanted their men in particular, because at that time, the education of women wasn't really common, wanted them to be well educated. And so people who established these early institutions really went out and marketed that they were going to do two things. They were going to educate your young men to be able to continue to maintain the economy that was rooted in slaveholding. And then they were going to educate savages, and they were going to establish these institutions for that charitable purpose of especially bringing young boys and men into what was then perceived as a better society, which is one that was based on European traditions and practices. So I like to mention that because I think sometimes we think of a higher calling in the establishment of American higher education. And I just think it's important for us as educators to be real about what was the motivation behind the establishment of higher education in this country. We also need to be really aware as Indigenous peoples that from those early days of the establishment of education pathways or often institutions in our communities, we hear a lot now about the boarding schools, and I think many of us, including myself, are either descendants of boarding school survivors or survivors ourselves. It's important as we think about the establishment of tribal colleges and universities to be truthful about the experience of boarding schools. So boarding schools were intentionally designed to remove Native people from their identity. There will be Native people who will say that boarding schools really help them, help their family, because perhaps their family didn't have resources. And I think it's important for us as educators and as well-informed citizens to recognize that the very fact that you need to be in a boarding school because your family does not have the resources to survive is the problem. So when so it's the very establishment of the boarding school system that is the issue. Individual experiences, are mostly negative for people, but I do recognize that sometimes people say otherwise. But what we do know is that there was an incredible loss of family, and I can share that, with my experience. Both my parents attended boarding schools. My mother a Catholic boarding school, and my father a government-run school. My husband attended two boarding schools, and so what I know is that the loss of family structure and the loss of family relationships had a devastating impact on the well-being of people. There was a loss of cultural experience and context. I think about the fact that when I was growing up, nobody said really to me, well, this is what Lakotas do, because you lived in that experience. You lived in that environment where you were practicing your cultural ways just normally. And now, of course, we find ourselves as educators having to mediate cultural knowledge and cultural experience. There was that loss of spiritual connection. And of course, the majority of these environments were Christian schools, and Native peoples, have our own religious practices. We have our own spiritual practices, and the schools deliberately took those away from us. And then we had, of course, this incredible loss of language, which we still suffer the consequences of. When you think about the establishment of tribally controlled education is intended to be restorative of those losses. It's intended to allow you to go to school where your family is. It's intended to be rooted in culture and cultural experience and context. It's intended to practice the spiritual connections that we, as Native people, have been able to retain, and it's restorative of language. So tribally controlled education in particular, but also I think other educational programming that is intended to support Native self-determination has some of the same characteristics. Also on the other side of that, in terms of just physical well-being, lots of illnesses and diseases occurred. There was a lot of emotional, physical, and sexual abuse, all the stuff that you hear, everything that we hear today about the boarding school experience, is no surprise to those of us who have been around for a while, kind of working with our communities to try to be restorative of people's well-being. So we have to work to be healed, really, of that experience. So that's some of that context. I always share with people, we're still here. The 2020 census remarkably identified 9.6 million people who either identified solely as American Indian or Alaska Native, or as that and another race. So we've gone from about 1% of the total US population to 2.9%. I've been doing some reading and research about this, and there is a general belief that people have become more comfortable identifying their own racial identity in this context. And there is some further study that was done by the U.S. Census that where people had the opportunity to name the tribal membership that they had, and that there's a belief that this figure is pretty accurate, even though it is probably an undercount, because people were actually able to name that. I also like to remind people that we're everywhere. One of the, I think, greatest challenges that we experience as Indigenous people is our visibility is very much tamped down by media and representation. And while we see more work in that area, it's real critical for us to be able to identify. I think I actually have the number wrong. I think it's over 580 federally recognized tribes as well as state recognized tribes. But we are urban, we're rural, and we're reservation. So we're everywhere. Leading up to the establishment of tribal colleges and universities were a number of legislative acts that influenced the establishment of tribally controlled institutions and contributed to our being able to not only be established, but to be able to function in a higher education space. I mention all of these laws, which you can see right here, because they are all part of the federal policy and the federal practices around Indigenous people's life experiences, our ability to govern ourselves, our ability to practice our religions, all of those kinds of things. We're one of the only populations where the federal government had actual laws and policies that impacted the way that we could live our daily lives. A lot of what we see happening with other populations has a lot to do with state practices, but in our case, it had everything to do with federal practices. And So all of these different laws and experiences really influence the establishment of the tribally controlled education movement. Three important eras for us, of course, in our recent memory: the termination era, where tribes were actually, their identity as tribes was removed. During that time, that was when a lot of relocation occurred, where people were actually sent, to live in cities, and we ended up now with generations of families that have been dispossessed from their tribal lands, even though they might have close identity and relationships there. The civil rights movement in the 1960s really influenced the establishment of tribally controlled education, because that was the same time that the American Indian movement was, coming to the forefront, and we really saw there's a strong link between controlling your own education and controlling your own ability to socialize your own children and civil rights. So I think that's a real important time. And if you study it, you'll see close ties between the early tribal colleges that were established in the 1960s and 70s and the American Indian movement, and resources that came to our tribal communities through the civil rights movement and the Great Society. Resources that came through Johnson had a lot to do with the early establishment of tribal colleges. And then, of course, the self-determination era, which began in the 1970s. So I always share with people that tribal colleges really, emerged out of this intentional practice of taking back our inherent right to socialize our own people and to educate our own people. And we had governments that were established through, a parallel process that also have an inherent authority and a constitutional authority to establish their own tribally controlled education movement. So that was a real important kind of history of that. The tribal colleges themselves really began, there was a lot of discussion among leaders about establishing a tribal college or an institution of higher education that had a tribal focus. The president, Justin Guillory from Northwest Indian College, and I authored a paper that was published in Daedalus, which is the Academy of Arts and Sciences publication, looking at the revolution that is the tribal college movement, and acknowledging that there had been a long history of some interest in the establishment of tribally controlled institutions. But the first sort of formal tribal college was established in 1968, Navajo Community College, which is now Dene College. It was really interesting to me that in researching and talking to different people who were part of the tribal college movement, that the original intention was to find an educational mechanism that would support people actually finishing college. So the early tribal colleges were really, they were looking at what can we create as a place-based institution that would ensure that our young people would get an education, because they were not getting an education in mainstream institutions. And it was naturally I think in the normal sort of course of business, naturally these institutions would be culturally based. They're place-based institutions. It's not surprising that their cultural identity kind of was established pretty much from the beginning. And just maintaining that has been an ongoing commitment. When I think about higher education as a revolution, I think when I first started working in the tribally controlled movement in 1981, there were many of the founders of the tribal college movement still living. And they were adamant that the work that we had to do to build place-based, culturally relevant education that was focused on self-determination, that we just had to do it. And I've always appreciated and valued that as a Native educator, that overcoming all of the obstacles that are put in our way to educate our own people is really something that our founders called upon us to do. And I often refer and think about these individuals here who are really part of that early movement, and many of whom are still here today. That there are currently 35 tribal colleges and universities that are members of the American Indian Higher Education Consortium. I'll talk a little bit about them again, but I wanted to give you a visual of where these institutions are located. They're not surprisingly located in the Northern Plains and the Upper Midwest, but we have several institutions in the Southwest. And I think there's a strong tie between physical access, and the establishment of tribal colleges. Because if you look at where they're located in highly rural environments. The American Indian Higher Education Consortium, just briefly talking about the two organizations that support the tribal colleges on the national level. They were established in 1973. They're a membership association. They are actually the core central collaborative organization of the tribal colleges, and they have two kinds of memberships. One is a full member, which is an accredited institution can apply for, and there are membership criteria related to the number of Native students in your institution and some other characteristics. And then there's also developing institutions where you have a tribal college that's emerging, and they have a membership opportunity there as well. The College Fund was established by AHEC actually to focus on bringing private sector resources, mostly to support students who are attending college. About 90% of the College Fund's scholarship resources go to students at tribal colleges. And the remainder go to students at other institutions or students who transfer from tribal colleges to PWIs. I did want to point out our newest visibility campaign at the College Fund. This is IndianCountry.com. Encourage all of you to go to that website, and you'll see our new campaign that is focused on bringing visibility to Indian country. Very provocative campaign. It has PSAs associated with it, as well as lots of advertising and media materials. But I encourage widespread use of those resources and taking a look at the This is Indian Country. Just real briefly, I wanted to talk about the tribal colleges and then open it up, Cynthia and Barbara, for any questions or comments that people want to make.
Okay.
I wanted to give the viewers a sense of the breadth of tribal college work. So tribal colleges work from infant to when you pass into the spirit world. Our institutions are very place-based and very culturally rooted, and are really restorative in their practices and uplifting of the community's use of their traditional knowledge and practices to promote our well-being and prosperity. So we do a lot of work in Indigenous early childhood education at our institutions, really working to empower families to work collaboratively with our institutions and with our education systems to ensure that our children have access to our traditional knowledge at an earlier age, and helping families navigate the gaps that are occurring as a result of that access to education. I think that we see this as a very important contribution that tribal colleges and universities make to our long-term well-being as communities. We also do a lot of K12 work with schools and with youth programs. I think probably the most important thing that we do is we educate Native teachers, administrators, and paraprofessionals. So if you want to be able to change a system, I think as everyone knows, you have to change the system from within. You can't just change a system by being an advocate outside of the system. You have to be able to have teachers and administrators and paraprofessionals in your system who are able to integrate culture and language and traditional knowledge into the whole school experience, both in the curriculum, but also in the co-curricular work that we do in our communities. We see the tribal colleges operating a lot of community-based programs, ranging from things like science camp to horse therapy programs, just giving that opportunity for young people to connect with not only their family, but people outside of their family, kind of in a restoration of the way we traditionally supported and lifted up our young people through, aunties and uncles and grandparents who also contributed to their well-being. So we do a lot of, at the tribal colleges, a lot of work in that area. And the College Fund has a very strong pathways program that helps Native youth and the institutions, the high schools that they are in, helps them access the college-going culture that we think is we know is real important to young people being able to see themselves as participating in post-secondary education. We also really, at the College Fund and at the tribal colleges, through AHEC, we understand that the ability that you have to provide for your family so that you can have food on the table, you can have shelter, you can access experiences, that it's very important for us to be able to support that and to help people kind of move into modern society through more support for career pathways. As many of you probably know, in our tribal communities, there's very limited access to what are the different career opportunities that you have. I think just even with Cynthia's introduction of Vernon, here's a person now who has moved from tribal governance into helping young people with their college experience. How many people in our communities know that that's an option? How many people realize that you can go and help young people have a better college experience through supporting their residential life? I mean, just being able to open those kinds of career pathways for Native students is, a tremendous contribution that we can make. We are all always concerned about the ability of our young people to get to have a successful experience with college so that they will stay in college and complete their educational goals. And then, of course, our tribal colleges and universities are deeply embedded in community. They do everything from helping people with accessing traditional foods, or being able to bring traditional, oops, I don't know what's going on with my computer, sorry. Doing things like, I've seen the establishment of immersion schools in communities where the tribal colleges are either operating the immersion school or are directly affiliated with it. The promotion of Native arts, helping people understand how they can take their skills and knowledge and become entrepreneurs. We just have such a breadth of programming among the 35 tribal colleges and universities that really impact the well-being of our communities. The College Fund, of course, is deeply concerned, as are, I know, the people on this call, about what is happening with the experience of Native students and what, in what we would call PWIs, or predominantly white institutions, or mainstream institutions. So we've actually at the College Fund worked with a number of organizations, with tribal colleges and universities, with some mainstream institutions, with policy makers around education, for example, I work with this on the Equity Advisory Committee for the State Higher Education Executive Officers organization, just really holding institutions accountable to creating a safe environment for Native students. So we've published I guess, series list of recommendations in this creating visibility and healthy learning environments for Native Americans in higher education. You can find it on our website. We also have a very robust research repository on our website that has a lot of information about best practices, as well as just research about Natives in higher education. But we are also working through a initiative that we have at the College Fund to develop tools that can be used by other institutions to assess how well they're supporting Native students. Our philosophy being that, having a physical space is critical, but what happens in that physical space is what really matters for students. So we do not only practice equity in our tribal college and university system, but we also advocate for equity for all Native students throughout higher education. And lastly, I like to share with people that there are resources that you can access to learn more about higher education and about Native people's experiences. The College Fund, AHEC, the National Indian Education Association, the National Congress of American Indians, and then on an international scale, the World Indigenous Nations Higher Education Consortium, also, which the tribal colleges are part of, also does a lot of work promoting Indigenous education. My last one, that's my contact information. The College Fund, as I mentioned, with our visibility, this is Indian Country Campaign. We're very committed to public awareness about the contributions of Indigenous people, not just that we are still here, but that our history, just as other people of color say, our history is American history. And it's very critical that we promote in many different ways our distinctiveness, as well as our interrelatedness with the rest of America. So we have a big campaign, Think Indian, which we use to promote the tribal colleges and universities. So that's just one of the pieces of collateral that goes with that. So, Cynthia, I am done with my presentation part. If there's some questions that.
There are some questions, Cheryl, but first I want to thank you. I'll thank you again, but I'm excited about the information that you shared. So the first question I have for you is, how do donations to the American Indian College Fund work? Do they go directly to students, or are larger projects the priority? Please provide some examples, and can a donor specify?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. So the College Fund's primary area of focus remains scholarships and student success. So most donations in the scholarship space go into two kinds of scholarships. One is what we call our TCU scholarship, where we distribute funds directly to tribal colleges and universities, and they award those funds to their students on their campus. Usually, though, there isn't a lot of criteria for that.
Mhm.
Those are intended to just be, I know, general scholarship support. Um, the other kind of scholarship that the College Fund does is what's called a full circle scholarship, and that's criteria-based scholarships. We administer those scholarships. Um, I'll give an example. We have a scholarship program through the Native American Agriculture Fund. And we give out some scholarships to students in the ag professions or ag fields. And we're also able to support some of the students in that program with research fellowships. So another example is we have a scholarship program that's funded by Walmart. And they have some criteria that's related to GPA.
Mhm.
So the scholarship criteria can really vary, but that's where most of the kind of donations that come from individuals go into is scholarship programs. We also have a lot of support that we provide for students with their success. So we support career education, coaching, a variety of different activities. Just last week, we had college and career fair activities. We had 3 days of those. So we do a lot to support students with their retention and completion. And then we also support tribal colleges and universities with programming. Those are generally funded by larger grants from
Mhm.
foundations and corporations. An example is that the Margaret A. Cargill Philanthropies funds our work in Native arts and culture. And we do a lot of distributing of small grants to tribal colleges and universities to do place-based arts and culture activities. So that's kind of where our funding goes.
Okay, thank you. I have another question that came in. As a former tribal college president, what are some of your memories of the impact that the tribal college has had on students and the surrounding community?
Yeah, so now I have worked for 40 years now in the tribally controlled education movement. I have personal successes in my own family of people who attended tribal colleges who would not have otherwise done so. I've often shared the story of one of my older sisters who, um, had a child early and was unable to, in those days, finish high school. And she got a GED. She got a teaching degree from Sinte Gleska University. And then she went on to teach for 34 years. She got a master's degree from Sinte. So I've personally witnessed not only members of my family, but other people who've had successful experiences. I've also observed that tribal colleges, they educate a lot of rural Americans
Mhm.
as well, who are not native. So, people from small towns and farming and ranching communities. I do think tribal colleges also contribute to better race relations
Mhm.
because people have that opportunity. And I've had people say to me, I didn't really know much about my native neighbors until I came to your institution and went to school with them. So I think tribal colleges contribute a lot, both to individuals and families, but also to just a better social environment.
Thank you for that response. I have another question. In general, what factors other than funding do you believe are essential to the success of a tribal college in achieving its specific institutional goals?
I think having the ability to recruit and retain qualified faculty. That is a big challenge for the tribal colleges because of their rural locations. So helping tribal colleges with faculty with fellowship programs and the opportunity for professional development to engage in kind of place-based research, I think is real critical. I think having the ability to network with other tribal colleges and universities, and then with other partners So we do see a lot of tribal colleges partnering with, other institutions in their state to deliver programming. I think that strengthens the tribal college experience. And I guess the last thing I'll share in that space, although there's a lot I could talk about, is that it's very important that tribal colleges be able to navigate and have support to navigate environments like accreditation. So accreditation is not generally a friendly experience for these unique place-based institutions, and having allies that help navigate that, I think is critically important to tribal college success.
Okay, thank you. I've got a couple more questions. Are there memories and learnings from your childhood that continue to guide you as a professional? What helps you to continue to serve others?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I actually just spoke about this in another setting. I grew up in St. Francis and Rosebud in South Dakota on the Rosebud Reservation. They are both small towns. I grew up in an extended family. Not that there weren't challenges in our family like there are in, I think most Native families, but I had that constant support and that constant sense of belonging. I think that was really critical. My grandmother gave me the name Wacinyanpi Win when I was in high school. She said to me that she saw that I always, tried to make sure that others were taken care of, serving them, or taking care of their needs when we got together as families. And I have taken that seriously, that having the name "They Depend on Her" means that I should be dependable and stick with it. And I love this work. The truth of it is that it's a privilege to get to contribute to the education of really generations of Native people now that I've been in this career for so long. So I think of it as sharing gifts, which we as Indigenous people value when people are able to share their gifts and navigate that environment. And I've had lots of, support over the years. So that's really highly motivating.
Wonderful. Another question is, I would love to know more about the spirituality of Indigenous people. Does each tribe have its own religion? How similar are the religions? Do you have resources for me?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I would say, so let me begin by saying all Indigenous groups of people have their own spiritual practices. Whether you would call that a religion, I think is, for people who are could debate that, whether they would call that a religious practice. But I think all Indigenous peoples have different spiritual practices. People have been very influenced by, Christian, the influence of Christian practices as well. I think curiosity is a good thing. There are books that are written, like there is a book out on Lakota beliefs and rituals, so people can read about those kinds of things. I think that, that's kind of all I know about that. I think curiosity about other people's religious practices is good for all of us. But whether or not you're invited into that spiritual practice is really up to the people that you know. Let me put it that way. When I went from Rosebud up to live among the Lummi people in the Northwest, I did not participate with their practices. That, in my view, that was their practices, and I didn't expect them to participate in mine. So I think it's a sensitive area. It's best to ask your friends. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for that information and that advice. I have one final question. Do you have unfulfilled dreams for tribal colleges?
Oh yeah, I think I'm a person who believes that every tribe should be able to have a tribal college. because tribal colleges are so able to focus on the whole person and the whole community, the whole family. So I do have an unrealized dream in that regard. I wish that there were sufficient resources and sufficient leadership, I guess, for us to have a tribal college, in every tribal community, and to be able to create the mechanisms that would allow people who do not live in place-based environments to access the place-based experience of the tribal college. And I'm hoping that with new technologies and more and more of our people getting educated, that we'll see more of that ability. I think of my relatives here in Denver or Chicago, and just how wonderful it would be for them if they could access classes from Sinte Gleska University, because that's their birthright. That's their inherent right. So yeah, that's my kind of unrealized dream. Full funding for all students who want to go to college.
Right.
Right.
That's everybody's dream.
Right.
Cheryl, it's been a pleasure and an honor to have you present to the Metropolitan Community College community. Your sharing of the history of tribal colleges has provided invaluable information to our diverse audience, and likely, I think by the questions, it's evidence that interest was sparked in ways that tribal education can positively influence and impact our educational experiences on campus. To our audience members, thank you for giving us your time today and for so many sessions this month. A special shout out to Vernon Miller for joining us today from New York. Your questions today, audience, has created a rich and even more interesting learning environment. And as always, please continue to consider Metropolitan Community College for your lifelong learning needs, even if you are no longer part of our physical community on campus.